This chair is a familiar one to you. But 10 years ago, when it was designed by Charles Eames, it was a revolutionary new chair, and I must say it caused quite a flurry.
Okay, here's History of Industrial Design, Week 9, Part 2, Charles and Ray Eames. The video that's playing in the background with the sound off is a television appearance that Eames has made in 1956 on the Arlene Francis Home Show, and it's become a really famous moment in design history. There wasn't anything especially unusual about this appearance when it aired, but seen through the lens of history, and with all the changes that have happened since, it's cringingly difficult to watch.
I wonder if you'd tell us some of the highlights of your careers in designing these chairs. How did you happen to get started with chairs? And Ray, shall we let Charles do it, or do you want to help with it? No, you see, as I told you, she is behind the man, but terribly important. Thank you, Ray. All right, Charles, let's start with the first one right here, shall we?
Those were the times. We have spent a lot of time since then teasing out what Ray Eames's role was in this partnership. And Charles had written about this. The problem of who does what is an after-the-fact thing that people feel they have to ask. We never asked. As with every industrial design office we've looked at so far this semester, the Eames office had a lot of people working there, and attribution was messy at the time, and it's been messy ever since. This is going to be an overview of the work of Charles and Ray Eames. Between 1945 and 1978, more than 40 major designs or ranges of designs or furniture went into production. So when you think about how hard it is to do any one thing, think about doing that many of them. More than 5 million Eames chairs were sold in the 25 years after they were first put into production. Although the Eames office is largely remembered today for the furniture output, there were many other things the office took on, including producing 125 films. It's generally understood in their work together that Ray, trained as an artist, was responsible for form and composition and color, and Charles, trained as an architect, was responsible for structure and technology and problem solving. Ray was a highly trained and skilled fine artist before they met. She had studied with Hans Hofmann in the mid-1930s in New York, and she also danced. She had studied dance with Martha Graham. Charles wrote about Ray, "She has a very good sense of what gives an idea or form or piece of sculpture its character, of how its relationships are formed. She can see when there is a wrong mix of ideas or materials, where the division between the two ideas isn't clear." From 1942 to 1947, Ray was commissioned to contribute covers to Arts and Architecture magazine. And I think you can see in that graphic design work a lot of the form language we associate with much later Eames projects. There are several fabrics also produced by the Eames office, some attributed to her, some attributed to both. As with the graphic design work, I think these shapes and patterns reappear in 3 dimensions in later office work. Saarinen, who was the designer of the Cranbrook campus and also its first president, was designing the music hall in Buffalo, New York with his son Eero Saarinen. Charles Eames and Eero Saarinen began working together to create furniture for this project. If you watch the first half of this week's content, which was the history of plywood, you might recognize the form of this chair as something very close to what Alvar Aalto was making in plywood. And that's no accident. Alvar Aalto had spoken at Cranbrook in the late 30s. And these Kleinens chairs show the same interest in having an understandable geometric wooden base combined with a more organic form created by using bent plywood. But the big step forward in switching from bent plywood to molded plywood that I discussed in the plywood history lecture happened in 1940 as a response to a call from the Museum of Modern Art in New York for a 1941 show called Organic Design in Home Furnishings. Although these chairs are radically different looking and way more organic and sculptural than the Kleinens chair had been, there were problems constructing this. It was impossible to mold these forms without the wood cracking, and so they were covered with fabric. When later asked if he was frustrated that he hadn't been able to make a one-piece chair that left the wood visible, Charles said, "This way we know we have the right answer." This process of trying and failing led to revisions which saw the chair covered in fabric, but also led to a greater understanding of what was possible in molding plywood. The furniture that Eames and Saarinen produced for the exhibition went on view at the MoMA, and they won first prize which led to a contract for production with furniture company Heywood-Wakefield. The furniture went into very limited production after the show. Only a tiny handful were made, for two reasons. One, World War II got in the way and materials and manufacturing were requisitioned for the war effort. And two, this was not a chair that really could be manufactured yet. So probably Heywood-Wakefield was the most pleased that America entered the war of anyone because it got them off the hook for making this chair. You can see the differences in the development of this chair also. The drawings submitted to the competition differed pretty dramatically from the realized prototypes, and then the manufactured production versions differed from the prototypes. They had to add extra structure to the legs. One of the things we forget when looking at these chairs is that they were actually part of a suite of furniture that created an entire environment. This is the actual installation view of the exhibition, and you can see the chairs we remember, the organic forms. But what really got them attention was the simpler upholstered chair on the left, because it used a new kind of construction inside to create the upholstered forms. I'm most intrigued by the rectangular furniture, because something that they understood was we would be able to appreciate the organic forms even more if they were surrounded by geometry, something that would set them off. This furniture, sadly, is almost forgotten, and I think it's as innovative as the organic furniture. These are case goods designed to be interchangeable, they're standardized, and they work in the background while all that organic stuff triumphs in front. But it's a really nice system with a bench or coffee table or base for stackable units above. Eames and Saarinen also signed a contract to produce this furniture in 1941 with Red Lion Furniture Company in Pennsylvania. After Cranbrook, Charles and Ray Eames moved to Los Angeles, where Charles got a job at MGM, and he would sneak materials out of the shop and bring them home, and Ray would fool around during the day and see what she could create. They were interested in furthering the investigations of what laminated sheets of veneer could be turned into. And they invented a machine in their apartment that they called the Kazam machine because of the noise it made when it was operating. And this is a device into which you would put your layers of veneer and a form, and then clamp it shut and inflate the bladder to press the veneer into the form. And the bed of this device is heated with electric wiring that plugs into the wall. So this is providing the pressure and the heat to set the glue as quickly as possible in the correct form. And this was just in the guest room of their apartment. Amazingly, when you look at this, and clearly consider it as pretty primitive technology, Ray was able to realize some really extraordinary forms in her effort to test the limits of what plywood could do. These objects were not designed to be repeatable. It didn't have the extra burden of having to hold a person up or function in any way. These were investigations that looked at sculptural beauty and form and also tested the limitations of the plywood. You can see one of them on view in the installation shot in the lower left at the Museum of Modern Art in 1944 in a show called Design for Use. They realized they were not going to be able to get as far with their investigations as they wanted because during the war there was no access to materials. It was impossible to get access to veneer and glue in a meaningful way. They ended up with an Army contract to produce laminated plywood leg splints, which were needed in large quantities affordably. So plywood was the perfect material for this. And this contract led to a 5,000-piece order and gave them the time and the materials to really start plunging into understanding all of the limitations of plywood manufacturing. The splint is iconic now, and it deserves its status as an icon because the amount of problem solving evident in its construction is impressive. There are essentially 7 different layers to the splint, and each sheet of veneer has been die cut so that when they're glued up together, they make the 3-dimensional form of the splint with all of the joints overlapping in different layers. So you get maximum strength and maximum form combined in one object by having really smart pattern making. When the layers are glued up, they're pressed in a mold that's heated till they're set, and you're done. And if you look at the splint shape, all of the openings are there for a reason. They're there to provide an opening to tie the splint onto a leg. They're there to relieve the pressure on the wood so that it won't crack as it goes around a curve or changes direction. There's also a hole at the end so that they can hang on a rack for finishing work. The Eameses experimented for a long time to get the right form, and part of the struggle was to get the right form to support a leg and fit a person, the ergonomic aspects of it, but the other part was to create a form that could be manufactured. In the experimenting, Ray took any of the forms that wouldn't work as a splint and recarved them into fine art. So you can see in the picture on the lower right a combination of splint experiments and failures turned into artistic triumphs. The splint product was such a success that the Eameses continued to work for the Army, trying to investigate where else plywood could be useful. So they looked at making a gurney for carrying people where the openings are functioning as handles. They also looked at making plywood seats for airplanes, because airplane seats were often made of sheets of plywood just screwed together. It's not hard to appreciate the step forward that molded plywood would offer. It's stronger, it's lighter, it will fit the body better. One of the things the Eameses developed for making this chair was a process technique that they used throughout their careers. So unlike the Dreyfus office, which made prototypes and put people in them and measured them and used math, the Eameses were more likely to build an adjustable jig that they could put people in and keep moving around until they had an actual three-dimensional object with the support planes in the place they wanted them. And then that information could be transferred. Over the course of the war, the Eameses became the go-to people for anything that needed to be made of molded plywood. They made nose cones and other parts for the CG-16 glider, the flying flat car, in 1943, and these molded pieces were 11 feet by 7 feet. They also had developed a group of employees who worked really well as a team and helped lay the foundation for what would happen after the war. By the time the war ended, the Eameses were ready to hit the ground running and apply everything they had learned about molded plywood to production items. It's so rare to have record of a team of designers from an industrial design office in this era, so I just wanted to show another one of the pictures from this photo shoot, because in it you can see Charles, Marion Overvey, Gregory Ain, Harry Bertoya. You can barely see the side of Ray Eames there, William Francis and Norman Bruns. And it really helps remind us that any kind of innovation is a group endeavor, takes a team. This was called the Eames office, but there were a lot of people under that umbrella. After the war, the race was on to figure out how to make a chair out of molded plywood. And there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. Should it have 3 legs? Should it have 4 legs? Should it be a combination of laminated wood and plywood? Should it be plywood and metal? Can it be one part that's the seat and the back, or do those parts need to be separated? Even when they had access to better wood and glue, there were still a lot of different problems to work through, and the office produced endless studies in a quest to make a single-piece chair. There were many, many iterations. They produced an office full of trials, and even when they figured out how to make the upper part of the seat, they then had to figure out what holds it up. And they were especially interested in developing a kit of parts that could be assembled into multiple different chairs, different heights, different materials. Charles was once asked, "Did you think of the Eames chair in a flash?" And he replied, "Yes, a sort of 30-year flash." And so at the far end of all of that investigation, the Eameses arrived at the ultimate answer to how to use molded plywood to create a chair. They removed the complexity of having the seat and back be one part and realized they just needed to be 2 separate parts, and they focused on the system that would hold those parts in place and considered how that system could be realized in metal and in wood. The plywood parts were molded in about 10 minutes, and hand finishing is minimal because you just have to do a little bit of sanding, so the prices could stay low. Originally, the DCW, the dining chair in wood, which is in the upper right, sold for $10.90, and the LCW, the low chair wood at the bottom, was $11.55. The metal frames cost a little bit more to make, but they weren't too far off of that. That's about $150 today. So although not the least expensive chair anybody could get, the amount of contemporary design you could get for $150 was pretty remarkable. It is interesting that in 1946, these chairs cost today's equivalent of $150, and yet a version of these chairs made today costs $1,200. There was a show at the MoMA in 1946 called New Furniture, designed by Charles Eames, where these chairs premiered. And you can imagine if you had grown up in a world where chairs were big, heavy, constructed things, this chair would seem ridiculously lightweight. So in the same way that IKEA today has a machine that opens and closes the kitchen drawer over and over again, or pushes down on the office chair seat to show you how durable it is, this show included a drum that rotated the chair endlessly to prove how durable it was. I secretly think IKEA replaces those drawers and those seats every morning. The first 5,000 of these chairs were essentially handmade in the Eames office, and then they produced the tooling to make the next 50,000 of them at Evans Products before transferring manufacturing to Herman Miller starting in 1947. And by 1951, the DCM chair, the dining chair with metal legs, was selling 2,000 a month. So just one of the versions of this chair, they were selling 2,000 a month. These chairs are all still made today, and they've been made in a sort of dizzying range of options over the years. They were initially introduced in a limited number of colors, but that's changed many times over the years. In assembling this slide, I was curious about the black and white cow patterned one, and then I looked more closely and realized it was not a cow. So on the lower right, I've put a more recent chair that has cow on it, but it's using cow to mimic what was on the original black and white 1940s chair, which is skunk. I'm not sure why, but skunk fur was used a lot in the 40s, so there's an investigation for someone to take on. There's a book by Kimberly Elam called Geometry of Design. It goes in and out of print every few years, and it's a little bit of a parlor trick, but it's a fascinating one. Kimberly Elam has analyzed the geometry of famous objects from design history, and many of the pages in the book have a transparent overlay to show you how rigidly they conform to the basics of geometry, and the Eames chair is no exception. It fits into a golden rectangle, the Fibonacci series of divisions line up with some of the details, and I think this is a great example of what Raymond Loewy would have called design intuition. Did the Eameses lay out the elevation of this chair in a golden mean rectangle? I doubt it. Did Ray have a really refined understanding of balance and form? Yes. I think it's more likely that smart decisions about a three-dimensional object led to something that had a lot in common with natural intrinsic growth. I want to go off-roading a little bit to help explain what was happening in America at the time that the Eames furniture arrived, because they were considering all of the things that were happening in their thinking about furniture. The first tract housing in the United States was built in New York by a man named Bill Levitt, which is why it was called Levittown. He had experience during World War II in the Navy designing military housing, and after the war he used what he learned to transform a potato farm on Long Island into a housing community. The houses were built fast and efficiently with price in mind. Each house had a concrete slab, and then pre-cut lumber was delivered from California with all of the things you needed to assemble the house. So the construction team could work their way through and assemble these houses very rapidly. By July of 1948, 30 houses a day were being constructed, and half of the first 2,000 homes were rented within 2 days. That helps you understand what a dramatic need for small, affordable housing there was after World War II. There were 5 models available, and the only difference was the window placement and the exterior color. By 1950, there were variants that included a carport and a built-in television. When they switched to selling the houses, they sold for $8,000. That's about $75,000 today, so certainly affordable houses for young families. And Levitt went on to build 3 other communities in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Puerto Rico. In 1951, the second Levittown was built in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, with just shy of 18,000 homes. And if you think about what would change in people's relationship when they lived in this kind of environment, think about what this kind of density would do to social structure. These are mostly young people with new families and young children living very close to each other, away from their families. You get some of the aspects of a shared living space that you'd find in an apartment building, but you also get the independent living that a house provides. The Eameses did a lot of thinking about where their furniture might end up. So although they might not have been designing for Levittown, they certainly were thinking about the new kinds of houses and the new ways people were using their houses. They were designing furniture that was easy to ship and easy to assemble, that was small and lightweight and durable and easy to clean. The text in a lot of the Herman Miller ads from the 50s helps explain this. The ad for the sofa says, "Comfort, durability, lightweight, and light scale." Ships in a flat carton to keep the cost down. Who could imagine that a sofa, traditionally the most cumbersome of home furnishings, could be stored in so compact a space? And the Eameses worked backwards from distribution system and user towards manufacturing and design. The sofa came in a cardboard box. You had to attach the bottom legs and then fold the back seat up, and you get the complete sofa with very little assembly work. In the same way that independent entertainment, like you're watching this on an iPhone or an iPad or your laptop, has separated you from your family or any other people around you, when television was introduced, it had the opposite effect. It brought families together in a way they had never been before. There was a new focus in the living room. As a result, all of the furniture needed to be movable. Before television, most American families had a radio, and a whole family could listen to the radio in the evening without being in the same place doing the same thing, because there's no visual focus to it. When you switch to television as the form of entertainment, everyone has to be sitting looking at the screen, which was quite small when they were new. And so furniture had to be easy to move because televisions lived in the living room, which was set up for entertaining. And then if you were going to watch TV, you turn the chairs towards the television or move them closer and watch a program. And we forget how recent this is. In 1948, there were only 102,000 television sets in the United States. 0.4% of the people had a television. By 1954, so 6 years later, 56% of Americans had a television. And by 1958, it was up to 83. So television was really part of how people were living in their homes, and any new furniture had to think about that as part of the landscape. You can imagine that the Eames chair, especially with the metal base, would be perfect for this situation. It's comfortable enough to work in a living room as a comfortable chair. It's light enough that you could move it around anywhere. So the tables at the bottom may not be radically interesting designs, but they certainly are useful additions to anyone who is thinking about how to use those chairs in their home. At the same time the chairs were taking off for the Eameses, they were producing radio housings made out of laminated wood. Over 200,000 of these were sold between 1946 and 1952, and yet today they're mostly forgotten because, let's face it, they're just not that interesting. They're rounded edge rectangular housings that did a good job holding the guts of the radio in place. They were also exploring what they could do beyond chairs, and some of their paper explorations and prototypes for animal forms in plywood are really exciting to look at. Only one was ever realized, the elephant, and even that was only made in a tiny edition of 2. But it's one of the Eames designs that's most remembered today. Vitra put it back in production in plywood in 2007, and then in 2008 added plastic versions. So why is it that we choose to forget the radios, all 200,000 of them, and remember the 2 elephants? Because of the form. The elephant is a triumph of material investigation and understanding the limitations of bending the plywood. Moving on from plywood, the Eameses looked at other technologies that were developed during World War II to see what they could do with them. Fiberglass had transformed boat hull manufacturing during the war, and the Eameses were on the forefront of exploring what else it could do when the war ended. Fiberglass is sheets of glass fiber and resin forced into an open-face mold. When it cures, it's rigid and strong and lightweight and a little bit flexible, but it requires draft angle. So it's perfect for a boat hull. You have an angled form that you can lay into a mold and then lift out. And the Eameses set about trying to figure out how that same thinking about form could work for furniture. La Chaise was originally designed in 1948 for MoMA's International Competition for Low-Cost Furniture Design, but it ended up being way too expensive to produce. It totally failed as an effort to make something that was low cost, and they only ever made the prototype. We're familiar with it because in the 1990s, Vitra put it into production, because by then, inexpensive was no longer the goal. Owning this remarkable piece of sculpture seating made by the Eameses was worth any price. Normally in class, I would pause to explain what the word excrescence means, and then talk about Katy Perry's twerking ice cream video. The reason I've included it is, of course, she ends the video sitting in La Chaise. And I think it's hilarious that the whole vibe of this is like future 60s. It's some retro 60s thing, but it's future Katy Perry thing with twerking ice cream. And I have to wonder if Katy Perry or her stylist or whoever chose La Chaise for this video to help support that 60s vibe had any clue that they were actually hearkening back to a 40s vibe. So design history matters in making smart, informed decisions about how to use objects to tell a story. As with all the other early Eames furniture, comparing the concept drawing to the prototype to the production version is really instructive. So all the way back in 1941, they realized that an organic form on legs would make a really interesting looking chaise. By the time they made Lachaise in 1948 using fiberglass, the form changed to reflect the material limitations. So on the right you can see the molds for Lachaise, which are an open face with draft angle, so that you could lift the molded form right out. And on the left, one of the many, many pictures from the Eames office of goofing around on the job. Even though Lachaise ended up being too expensive for a low-cost furniture show, it was part of the material investigation that led to the shell chairs, which were wildly successful. The arm shell did win a prize at that show and did go into production, and now it's just about everywhere. And again, there were endless iterations in the arriving at this form, in the developing it, in the altering it over time, and in thinking about how to create a system where there were endless variations available in the future. So there are multiple bases. They developed another shell without the arms. They were originally produced in 1948 in fiberglass by Zenith Manufacturing, but then as soon as possible they switched the material to a moldable plastic because fiberglass is actually really destructive to the health of the workers. Another material investigation triumph, which we'll revisit next week when we look at Noel and Harry Bertoia, is the wire mesh chair. World War II saw a big advance in electric welding. Arc welding was finally perfected around 1948, and so after the war it could be used to produce this chair. Also, polyurethane foam was new and became widely available from 1954, so sort of all of the DNA of this chair comes out of new ways of using materials. I'm intrigued by this chair because Harry Bertoia's chair for Noel came out of this project. He was working at the Eames office at the time. The frustration with working at the Eames office and not getting attribution came to a head, and he left and went to Noel and produced his chair for them. I actually think this is a smarter chair, because if you look at how it's constructed, the wire is welded into a grid in the areas of the chair that remain relatively flat, and it's left loose end rods that are more flexible where it needs to bend more. So the Eameses were able to take what they knew about wood cracking when you laminate veneer and apply it to this new material, which was a grid of wires. So they've left more flexibility where it needs to exist so that this flat sheet can be bent into a three-dimensional form, and they're finally able to realize, as with a fiberglass chair, one structure that is both the seat and the back, which they hadn't been able to do in wood. And then the Eames chair has this channel groove that goes around the outside to contain those sort of metal fins. And it's a really nice hybrid of fussy handwork and something that can be done in production in large quantities. So remember this chair next week when we look at the Bertoia one. One of my favorite Eames products to look at is the storage unit of 1950, because compared to their other efforts, it's kind of a failure. It was designed to have standardized interchangeable parts and to be shipped knockdown. So the sales chart on the upper right shows all the different configurations, and there's different colored patterns and different textures and different materials. It turned out the assembly was really difficult. It was too hard to put together. So they had to change it to be something that was not knockdown, that was shipped assembled, which made it very expensive to ship. And also they were trying to make it work in a number of different environments, for the home, for the office. And the problem is, for the home, it was a little too aggressive and aesthetic. It's a little too sparse for most homes at the time. And for an office, it didn't really function as well as office equipment needed to. So in trying to make it do too many things for too many people, they weren't really able to make it do as much as it needed to. The storage unit didn't consider the market as well as it needed to and understand the user as clearly as it needed to. And I suspect the Eames has learned a lot from this failure because it's almost a unique example of something they made not really working out. Throughout the 50s, the Eames office was examining new environments that would need furniture. One would be dorms. By 1960, many of the baby boom children were going off to college, and colleges needed new dorms fast and new furniture for the dorms. The Eames office produced a wall unit that was an integrated system of storage with furniture, a desk, a bed, and shelving, all built as one structure. Although it was installed at a number of colleges, it was not as successful as expected, partly because federal support for state university dorms ended right when this was launched, and also a lot of students started living off campus in the 1960s, which was unexpected. It was installed at Purdue, SIU Carbondale, U Michigan, the YMCA in Charlotte, North Carolina, a bunch of different places. RISD built new dorms at this time as well, and although there are wall units built into those, they are sadly not the Eames contract storage set. And the Eameses used their understanding of new environments to keep adapting their furniture lines to work in new places. So the same shell might have different bases that would make it work in a living room, in a dining room, on the patio, in an office, at a school. And it's almost like a magic trick how different the character of these chairs is, their personality changes, with just swapping out the different structure underneath. Also, anyone who's been noticing the names of all these chairs, they're always letters and they're always abbreviations for the components. So DAL is dining height armchair with a La Fonda base. A DAR is a dining height armchair with a rod base. A DSW is a dining height side chair with a wooden base. The Eameses also embraced new materials, and aluminum is a big part of the Eames story. World War II forced or asked the aluminum industry to increase production capacity by 600%. So you can imagine if you owned Alcoa, when you saw the war ending, you were going to panic. We've got to find a way that 600% increase can continue after the war by creating a need for aluminum. After 1945, the aluminum industry really worked to promote itself, so we see a lot of really interesting experimental aluminum designs happening. And the Eameses were part of this forecast collection that Alcoa started. They set aside $3 million in 1957 to promote aluminum by having designers make stuff in aluminum with no real requirement that that stuff be reasonable or marketable or profitable. And the Eameses certainly were not worried about profitability when they introduced the solar do-nothing machine. It uses a solar panel to turn some motors to make little colored gear things spin around. Totally delightful, although I doubt it did much to promote aluminum. What it did was get the Eameses familiar with aluminum and interested in working with it. And that's where this investment really paid off for Alcoa. Also after the war, huge deposits of aluminum were located in Australia and Guinea and Canada. And in 1956, Kaiser Aluminum introduced the first aluminum beverage can. So there are many reasons that aluminum became such a visible part of the 1960s. The Eameses started developing different kinds of aluminum furniture, and just like with plywood, the material limitations informed the design and the structure of these chairs. This is a picture of Ray and Charles fussing over the details in an aluminum chair, and on the bottom you can see a series of castings in different degree of finish that will become base pieces for those chairs. They developed some really innovative approaches to structure using aluminum. The aluminum group chair on the left is like a tension compression system, so the cast side pieces have a groove into which you slide the leather panels or the fabric panels, and then they have spacers across the bottom and the back to introduce rigidity. Another new environment of the early 60s was airports. By 1961, a plane took off every 84 seconds in America, and airports were expanding at a really rapid rate. The tandem sling seating was designed originally for Washington's Dulles International Airport, and it's a triumph of aluminum castings. I don't have a good way to explain how clever this seating is. Fortunately, it's still in place in so many airports that you'll be able to see it on your own. The tandem sling seating is a kit of parts that can be assembled in any number of configurations. And the picture on the top is from the Eames office. It shows Jim Summers proving how strong a run of these chairs is. The picture on the top is from the Eames office, and it shows the different cast components that make up the seating. The other pictures are ones I took at the airport while everyone was looking at me like I was crazy. Because when I started investigating how it actually goes together, I realized what a beautiful system this is. It looks like one considered form in aluminum, but it's actually many parts that are designed to sequentially clip in place and hold the leather inserts and attach to the steel T-bar at the bottom. So next time you're in an airport and see this, take a good look at how it's constructed. Another good example of an aesthetic being created by manufacturing techniques is the soft pad chaise on the bottom. I think it's a beautiful form, but examining how it's constructed makes it even more exciting. The base is one casting used twice for the leg supports, and it's thicker and thinner not only according to the structural requirements, but also to allow the aluminum to flow through the mold better. And it's connected with a section of an extrusion that has channels ready to receive the screws that hold it together. So it's just another example of the Eames combination of aesthetics and manufacturing. One of the most iconic Eames chairs is the lounge chair and ottoman introduced in 1956. And this chair has roots all the way back in the original plywood investigations when the goal was to try and make one form that had both seat and back. And it's another example of giving up on that idea and pursuing a structural component system where you get one unified form out of separate parts. The The lounge chair was expensive. It sold for $400 in 1956. But between 1956 and 1975, over 100,000 were sold. This was a really, really successful product. It generated over $100 million in retail sales. Many of the films that the Eameses made were created to promote their own products. And this is a film they made to explain the construction of the lounge chair. It has a soundtrack by Elmer Bernstein. I will attach a link so that you can watch it. It's really engaging. I don't want to make this video overlong by letting it play, but it's a fantasy of someone in the factory assembling this chair, sitting in it, being transported out of their humdrum life and becoming a titan of business with a lovely wife to serve him, and then snapping back to reality and disassembling the chair and putting it in a box. And it helps you understand how simple this system is, where the molded plywood parts are all made with the same form. They nest together in a box. The whole chair was designed to fit neatly in one shipping box and be ready for easy assembly. Between 1950 and 1982, Charles and Ray Eames made over 100 short films. Many made at their studio, but also many of them made actually in their home. And here's a picture of the Eameses in their guest room working on Toccata for toy trains. This is a movie that's really worth watching. It's all stop animation using toys, and it's beautifully produced. Their most famous movie is Powers of 10, and when you watch it, which you must, remember that it's pre-digital. It is almost impossible to imagine how that movie was made without the use of a computer. And yet it was all done with film and moving cameras. The Eameses designed and built their own house in 1949 out of mostly prefabricated components, and it's a house that's well studied in architectural history classes, well visited. You can visit it today, although you have to get very expensive tickets very far in advance. Something that all of my students have to do this year is write user profiles, is start to understand how to describe the person they're designing for. The Eameses did this for their own house. They produced a really beautiful document describing the people who would live in the house, even though it was them. And they didn't just describe what they wanted in their house. They described the activities, the emotions, the expectations. It's a really early example of a user profile. And I'll dig that document up and figure out a way to share it with you. The Eameses also created a number of extraordinary exhibitions and really helped develop the art of exhibition design. They were hired by IBM to create Mathematica, a World of Numbers, which would explore not only the history of mathematics, but the basic concepts. Two of these exhibitions still exist. One is at the Museum of Science in Boston, and one is at the Science Museum in Queens. The installations that materialize math concepts are really beautiful, showing multiplication with a three-dimensional grid of light bulbs, or explaining the concept of a Mobius strip by having a three-dimensional model with something running around the surface is so much more satisfying than having any of these concepts explained to you. I grew up in the shadow of these exhibitions, and that idea of the timeline with stuff glued to a wall was like my idea of the worst sixth grade field trip ever. Then in 2012, IBM put out an app for the iPad of Mathematica, and it blew my mind because what I didn't understand about the Eameses exhibitions is that they were predicting hyperlinking. The Mathematica app features the timeline, and you can press on any of the information or people and get to secondary pages. And then you can also click between math concepts and illustrations of how they work. So what the Eameses were doing was creating a real-time live environment that allowed you to create a personal experience hyperlinking information. The Eameses reunited with Saarinen to create the IBM Pavilion for the 1964 World's Fair. It was called the Egg, and inside the Egg was the Ovoid Theater. Visitors would file in and sit in the bleachers, which was called the People Wall, and when the bleachers were full, they would rise up through the floor of the Egg. And inside the theater was a multimedia presentation that explained lessons in problem solving created by the Eames office. Again, this is before computers. This used 22 screens with synchronized slideshows and films, and it made problem solving understandable not for scholars and engineers, but for everyone. It helped explain that the approach we would all have to a familiar problem is the same approach a scientist or scholar would use when approaching a complicated problem. And after the World's Fair was over, the Eameses produced this film with some of the content from that exhibition. I'm going to let it play because it's narrated by Charles Eames so you can hear his voice, and it so beautifully explains so much of what the Eames office was working towards.
The problem that follows is closer to our everyday experience, but the steps toward its solution are very much the same.
The Hartmans are back. Now we just have to give that party. Let's see, the 25th is Harry's birthday. That's a week from Thursday. No, Harry's boss and his wife will be here Friday, and we really should give it for them. And it should be black tie. They'd enjoy meeting the McKnights. And I almost forgot Dr. Schlosser. Where's that list? The Coopers will be fun. Harry's sister and her husband. What's that do to the seating? Let's see, Jane is on Harry's left, Mrs. Townsend's on the right, Mr. Townsend on my right, and Steve here. Mimi Cooper next to Mr. Townsend. Now she'll talk his ear off. I'll put her next to Steve. He's a little hard of hearing. George McKnight here, Alice Hartman and Dr. Schlosser. Now he's apt to pinch Mrs. Townsend. I'll put him next to me. And move Steve between Mimi Cooper and Alice Hartman. And I'll put George McKnight next to Mrs. Townsend, and on the other side, Virginia McKnight and Charlie Cooper. That puts him opposite Steve. Oh, not after that incident last Saturday. I'll raise the centerpiece. That leaves Sam Hartman. Wait a minute. Now, how many do I have? I have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 13? I'll have to invite another girl. Cleo Fenwick will be back from Reno by then. No, the wives wouldn't like that. I guess I'd better scratch Dr. Schlosser.
She stated her problem, abstracted the essentials, tried out the relationships, and made her decision.
So this is not just problem solving, this is also design process. State the problem, collect the information, abstract the information, build a model, and then test that model, manipulate the model. The Eameses were hired to create glimpses of the USA for the American National Exhibition in 1959 at the Moscow Pavilion. This consisted of 7 huge screens. Each one was 60 feet across. And as a result, the whole show was as wide as a football field. The slideshow ran for 12 minutes. It used 2,200 still images. And remember, again, pre-digital, no computers, slides. So for every one of those 2,200 slides, there probably were 20 or 30 more slides that didn't get used. If you want to do a deeper dive into the Eames exhibition work, there is a beautiful description of how this show unfolded. The last-minute production, the getting the film there, the accidental, profoundly meaningful ending of this slideshow, and how it helped, instead of showing that America was different from Moscow, actually tell a bigger story of how all of us across the world are universally the same. So I talked mostly about furniture. I mentioned that there's some movies but left them off. I showed you a little bit of exhibitions. There is so much more to talk about with the Eames office output. The Eames has made a serious effort to help advance design education in India. They produced the India Report in 1958. They produced a show about Nehru. In 1961, with the founding of the National Institute of Design, they became design professors there. And part of the reason they could be so prolific was their really exceptional team of employees. 438 people worked at the office between 1943 and 1979, and that's not counting consultants who worked externally with them. Any of you who have been with me so far this semester have probably gotten frustrated at how much energy I spend trying to shed the spotlight onto some of the people who are behind the scenes or accidentally forgotten or intentionally overlooked. We are very lucky that Ray Eames is now considered part of this equation. It's almost always Charles and Ray Eames now, but that's a relatively recent situation. I heard her speak in 1988 when she came to Rhode Island. Yes, I met Ray Eames. And at the time she was working really hard to put herself in the equation. After Charles died, she spent about 10 years lecturing about their work, and it was a surprise to most people that she was claiming authorship, that she was saying she had been part of the process, because up until that point, it was just the work of Charles Eames. And that's why I love this picture, because it shows them not only together, and it gives you a sense of their adventurous spirit, but it also puts Ray right there in the driver's seat. I also want to show you this image because it's a really useful model for thinking. It's also really difficult to read because Charles had handwriting almost worse than mine. So I've recreated it just so we can make sense of it a little bit better. This is a statement of the Eames design process, which he created in 1969. And the basic idea is it's a Venn diagram with overlapping areas. Unlike a Venn diagram, which is always circles with a really neat overlap, Charles realized that there's no such thing as a circular amount of information, and as a result, there's no such thing as a neat overlap. Also, there are rarely three components that affect an equation. The blue area represents the interests and concerns of the design office. What are the people at the office interested in doing? What are they able to do? What are they good at doing? The red area is the genuine interest to the client. What does the client need done? So where the client's needs and the designer's abilities overlap is the opportunity. But there are other layers. The yellow is the concerns of society as a whole. If the designer is able to satisfy the client, but the solution is outside the interests of the public, you haven't solved the problem. And then the area in the middle is the overlapping interest and concern that the designer can work with conviction and enthusiasm. Note, these areas are not static. They grow and develop as each one influences the other. Also note, putting more than one client in the model builds the relationship in a positive and constructive way. I find this to be a reassuring document for a couple of reasons. It allows you to be whatever shape you want to be. It encourages you also to affect your shape. If there's something you're interested in learning about, if there are jobs you want to be able to take on, you can change your shape so that it suits them better. You could steer yourself towards clients that better match where you are, or you could change your shape. You could also help your clients change their shape to better match what you're able to do. In addition to good sales, the Eameses had really strong, recognizable form language, which still influences design. People call this mid-century design, but we're still working in the shadow of this thinking about form. Design Within Reach, as recently as 2 years ago, had over 45 different items the Eameses designed in their product line. That's the sign of really good design work. So that's all you have to watch about the Eameses. But if you want a language lesson, stick around for some grammar. When students do writing for me that involves Charles and Ray Eames, there's a level of panic that enters their writing when they have to figure out how to describe them with language. And they invent all sorts of delightful, charming, amusing, and wrong ways to do that. Any name that ends in S presents some complications when you're dealing with the possessive. In English, you almost always just add apostrophe S to show possession. So if a child owns a bicycle, it's the child's bicycle. But if children, a group of childs, owns the bicycle, it's the children's bicycle. Same thing with man, man's or men's. Where it gets complicated is with words that are pluralized by adding an S. So an elephant's bicycle, apostrophe S. But if you have a group of elephants who are sharing one bicycle, the plural of elephant is elephants, which ends in S, so you just add an apostrophe. And so that's the rare exception. The problem is most people panic and use the rare exception most of the time. So let's look at how this plays out with Charles and Ray Eames. Eames could be Charles Eames, Eames could be Ray Eames. If there's a bicycle and you ask whose bicycle is that and you say it's Eames's bicycle, that could be Charles Eames's bicycle, it could be Ray Eames's bicycle. But if Charles and Ray own that bicycle together, it's the Eames's bicycle. Eames's is plural. You just add the apostrophe at the end. Then we know that that bicycle belongs to both of them, not to one of them. So the rule is, when something is singular, add apostrophe S, no matter what. I don't care if it ends in S or not. If it's plural, add apostrophe S almost always, most of the time. The only time you just add the apostrophe is if the word as a plural ends in S. A lot of people will tell me I'm wrong and fight me on this, but there will be many times in life where you need to know whose bicycle that is. And if you don't know how to do the plural possessive correctly, you could get into a fight over that bicycle. There you go. There's part 1 of my new series, Grammar You Never Asked For. I'm going to leave impactful for a future conversation.